So the long-awaited Rings of Power series has premiered its first 2 episodes. I've watched both of them twice, and here are my many thoughts. This is going to be a long video, so buckle in. I'm going to first discuss the prologue and then go over each plotline separately instead of going through the episodes in chronological order. So the show starts off with a prologue that is both a stepping off point for Galadriel as a character as well as something of a summary of the First Age, albeit an extremely abbreviated summary. They definitely changed quite a lot, and we're going to go through it bit by bit. Honestly, I was taking notes while watching, and at one point I just stopped because they had changed so much from Tolkien's work. I say that, of course, as a Tolkien purist, which some would use as a derogatory term. I understand that there are many people just watching the show for what it is and know nothing about the lore. Those somewhat familiar with the lore, and even those more knowledgeable than myself, who are able to look past the deviations from Tolkien's writing. I'm not one of those people. I want to get that out of the way now because that will determine the standard for my review of every single episode of this series. So back to the beginning. Galadriel and some elf children are playing by the water, and I believe this is the first time that elven children have been depicted in a live-action adaptation of Tolkien's work. But the children are deriding Galadriel for taking a while to build a paper swan. Apparently, origami existed in the beginning of Middle-earth. She sets her swan in the water, and the other kids start throwing rocks at it, angering her, and leading her to start attacking them. So already we see that Galadriel is set apart from the other elves, which is a recurring theme throughout the first 2 episodes. And the swan in the water is, I believe, meant to represent her desire to sail off into a distant land eventually, something that Tolkien vaguely stated was a desire of hers in the Silmarillion. We are also introduced to her older brother Finrod, who throughout the first episode is shown to be very close to Galadriel and something of an inspiration for her later endeavors. It's interesting seeing the age gap between the two, as when I read the Silmarillion, the childhood of the elves is never really described, so I always picture them as being much closer in age. They end up discussing the difference between a rock and a ship, how one sinks into darkness and the other is looking up to the sky. But when Galadriel brings up the fact that the sea can reflect the stars just as brightly, how do you know which direction to follow? To which Finrod responds by saying, sometimes the only way you can know is by touching the darkness. This idea will be touched upon in episode 2. One thing that I started to notice about Galadriel is the writers are constantly placing her at odds with her peers from the very start, and yet are always showing her as being right while everyone else is wrong. And after watching the scenes of her childhood, as well as the way she acts as an adult, I started to think, I've seen this somewhere before. And then I remembered Captain Marvel, and I really hope we're not going down that road with Galadriel's character. But moving on, we get a brief shot of Valinor, and except for the 2 trees, it's not quite as magical looking as I expected. From the way it's described in the Silmarillion, you would almost picture it as being something akin to heaven, and I'm not quite sure that they hit the mark. But if you've read the Silmarillion, let me know what you thought about their depiction of Valinor in the comment section below. We also get what is likely to be the only depiction of Morgoth in the series, Morgoth being the original Dark Lord, far more powerful than Sauron. And he is responsible for killing the 2 trees Lorelin the Golden and Telperion the Silver, which provided light to Valinor, although in the Silmarillion, he was aided in this task by the giant spider Ungoliant. If you are unaware of Tolkien's lore outside of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and also don't know about the background of this series, Amazon only acquired the rights to The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and the appendices of The Lord of the Rings, which contains some but not all information on the different ages, the genealogy of the elves, the dwarves, and men, and stuff about language and other little bits. So they don't have access to the Silmarillion, the Tale of Beren and Luthien, the Children of Húrin, the Fall of Gondolin, or the upcoming book The Fall of Númenor, except for a few pieces of information that they've licensed. So they can't get into a lot of detail concerning the First or Second Age, and yet decided to make this show take place in the Second Age, because their idea was, Tolkien didn't say that this stuff didn't happen. I mean, we can't know since he didn't write it, and we can't really know his intentions, despite the fact that there is literally a book containing his letters, many of which concern his thoughts and intentions regarding his work on Middle-earth. He even mentioned in letter 133, which is placed in the second edition of the beginning of the Silmarillion, about how these stories didn't need to be told. And I think their reasoning is not just extremely flawed, but also absolutely ridiculous. Just because you can't use information from those other books doesn't mean that you should ignore that same information or provide new information that opposes it as it pertains to what you're depicting in the series. But back to the story. Morgoth's desecration of the 2 trees causes a unification of the elves who decide to travel to Middle-earth intent on ending the evil of the Dark Lord. Now, the scenes depict something that is similar to the oath of the Sons of Feanor and the result of the kinslaying without actually saying that those events took place. In the Silmarillion, Morgoth stole the Silmarils, 3 jewels created by the Noldoran elf Feanor, who was known as the greatest of the Noldor. The Silmarils held the last of the light that was present in the 2 trees, which is why Morgoth desired them. After they were stolen, Feanor swore an oath along with his 7 sons to go to Middle-earth and reclaim the Silmarils at all cost. This was against the Council of the Valar, who are the gods or powers of the world, and this oath eventually became a curse known as the Doom of the Noldor. The other 2 groups of elves, those being the Vanyar and the Teleri being the greatest shipbuilders, chose not to aid the Noldor, so Feanor's group killed a number of the Teleri and stole many of their ships. This event was known as the Kinslaying. Some of the members of the Noldor, those being the members of the House of Finarfin, who were the half-brother of Feanor, though the children of Finarfin contained Teleri blood through their mother. Feanor's kin decided to follow him to Middle-earth, some in kinship and some, like Galadriel, with the desire to hold dominion over new lands, as well as to foil the efforts of Feanor and his sons, as they had slayed some of her kin. So you have 2 very significant aspects of the elves' motivation for going to Middle-earth that were substituted with the simple reasoning of Morgoth is evil, so we need to go fight him. Again, those events took place in the Silmarillion, which Amazon doesn't have the rights to. I guess they did the best they could, but as a reader, it seems to me that it removes the path for a lot of the history of Middle-earth to have taken place in this live-action universe. Another deviation from the source material is the death of Finrod, which is a big deal not just because it isn't correct, but because something incorrect becomes the main motivation for Galadriel, the main character of the show. The episode states that after the fall of Morgoth, Sauron becomes the new Dark Lord, which is true, although they show him in a form similar to that which we saw in Lord of the Rings, even though he doesn't take that form until much later. But Finrod apparently died fighting Sauron and was marked by him. In the Silmarillion, Finrod was killed before the fall of Morgoth, and he was killed fighting a werewolf under the service of Sauron, which they kind of allude to with the claw marks, but Sauron hadn't marked Finrod's body. They just added that into the show to make Sauron out to be some kind of boogeyman. I also almost forgot to mention that a battle was depicted there in the First Age, during which Finrod and a company of elves are being overwhelmed by orcs. Now, I can't account for the eagles and what seems to be dragons or precursors to the fell beasts of the Nazgul, but my best guess is that this is taking place at the Fen of Serech, which is one part of the battle known as the Dagor Bragolok, which ended the 400-year-long siege on Angband, the fortress of Morgoth. So after Finrod's death, Galadriel takes up his oath, which again seems to just be an oath to fight evil, which is in this case Sauron, which I think is Amazon's way of depicting the Noldor as having an oath, but at the same time not mentioning the Silmarils. Apparently Galadriel and a group of elves spend centuries searching for clues of Sauron, which brings us to the present day in the show, where Galadriel's company is located in the frozen wastes of Forodwaith, a region in the north of Middle-earth, where they find a cavern fortress where they discover an orc who practiced sorcery, which doesn't seem quite right to me. I don't believe orcs in Tolkien's work were capable of that kind of thing. They also fight an ice troll, and quick note here, I've noticed that since the first Hobbit film, that they've changed the designs for some of the evil creatures we've already seen, making them appear more monstrous and exotic. Personally, I prefer that they stick to the same designs. To me, it seems like a way for them to make this series seem more interesting by throwing different looking creatures in there. The fight against the troll is also really weird. All of the elves except Galadriel fight like absolute morons against a troll that looks smaller than the mountain troll that the Fellowship fought. And these are Second Age elves. They should be stronger and much better fighters than any in the Fellowship. It reminded me of the scene from Obi-Wan Kenobi where those 2 bounty hunters were attempting to kidnap Princess Leia, and they seem to deliberately run into trees and trip over air. Of course, Galadriel swoops in and kills the troll quite easily. But after this event, her company abandons her, and it's only until she arrives in the elven city of Lindon, which looks pretty cool by the way, that she learns that it was actually she who was disobeying the orders of Gil-galad, the High King of all the elves in Middle-earth. Concerning the elves in Lindon, we meet short-haired Elrond, who is apparently the speechwriter of Gil-galad, which seems kind of pathetic for the High King of all the elves of Middle-earth. Galadriel returns to the elves to talk about Sauron again, and also to tell Elrond, "You haven't seen what I've seen," which is technically true. She is much older than he is. It's just the way she says it that's kind of annoying. Gil-galad denies the existence of Sauron, but also hands out a trip to Valinor for Galadriel and her companions, which really isn't something that's in his power to give. That's something the Valar, which are again the gods of the world, get to decide. And not only does Galadriel agree to go, but she was shown previously lamenting the fact that she was barred from returning, despite also arguing with Elrond that she needs to stay and fight evil, saying, "What would I be without a sword?" Completely missing the point of Galadriel's character. I'm not going to get into Galadriel's whole timeline in this video, that'll be a video for a different time, but I will say that while Galadriel in the Silmarillion was described as being athletic and tall, she's also described as the wisest of the Noldor. At this point in her life, she should be around 2,000 years old. She was described as being wiser than Feanor, who was the greatest of the Noldor during the beginning of the First Age. So she is far past the point where she should be this hard-headed and manic. But like I said, she goes on the journey to Valinor, even though in Tolkien's writing, she doesn't even leave the shore of Middle-earth until after the events of The Lord of the Rings. In fact, in the books, she is married and has a daughter by this point, and I haven't seen either of those characters. And it's at this point in the 2 episodes where Galadriel's story deviates from Elrond and Gil-galad. So she ends up having a crisis of conscience on her journey to Valinor. Right as the skies open up to allow her and her compatriots to sail on to Valinor, while the other elves accept the light, she jumps into the water, and I get that she's going to make it back to the shore, because she obviously can't die, she's the main character, but it's still stupid of the writers to just have her jump off the only boat in the middle of the ocean. I mean, she doesn't know that she'd come upon another boat, so was she expecting to just swim all the way back? She ends up meeting the survivors of a shipwreck who distrust her because she's an elf. Almost all of them get killed by a sea monster except one guy who lets her on the raft, and they start making their way back to Middle-earth. This guy's name is Halbrand, who is another original character for the show, who is from the Southlands, where the Arondir and Bronwyn story is taking place. More on that later. It also seems like maybe they could end up setting this up as some sort of romance, and I'm really hoping that that isn't the case. I could see them doing a story where the powerful, beautiful, brash elven woman meets the handsome rogue, and they hate each other at first, but eventually fall in love. And all I can say is, Amazon, please don't turn The Lord of the Rings into Tumblr fanfiction. Now, next week, I believe we're getting introduced to the Númenóreans because a ship of them seems to have come upon Galadriel and Halbrand. This will introduce another storyline, probably filled with more original characters. God forbid the majority focus of the show, based on Tolkien's work, features characters that the man created. We now move on to the region of Eregion, the land of the Elven Smiths, where Elrond was assigned by Gil-galad to aid the great smith Celebrimbor, who I know is a man, but the actor looks like an old British woman. I wish they had done something closer to the design of Celebrimbor from Shadow of Mordor. Elrond would be aiding Celebrimbor in creating a forge more powerful than any ever built. We also get a look at the Hammer of Feanor, as well as a mention of the Silmarils. I assume that the special forge that they'll be building will end up being what they use to create the Rings of Power, and maybe they'll use the Hammer of Feanor as well. One weird thing that they wrote into the scene was that Morgoth was entranced by the beauty of the Silmarils for weeks, and it was only after a tear fell and he saw his own evil reflected back at himself did he break out of the reverie. That never happened. Morgoth was burned by the light of holding the Silmarils, and it permanently blackened his hands. So he ended up setting them in an iron crown, and even that close proximity still hurt him to a degree. Him shedding a tear seems like they're trying to humanize Morgoth, like, oh, he's the most evil being out there, but even he can cry. Which is like, no, that's stupid. Now, in the Silmarillion, he was entranced by the elven princess Luthien dancing in front of him, but it was more of a dark lust than a recognition of beauty. Since the elves don't have the workforce to complete the forge, Elrond travels to Khazad-dûm to meet with his friend Prince Durin, who is angry at Elrond for missing his wedding. But after they engage in a challenge, they make up, and Elrond meets Durin's family, including his wife Disa, who is another original character for the show, not someone from any of the books. And talking about dwarven women, there were way too many of them in these scenes. Tolkien stated that dwarven women make up only about a third of the entire race. In fact, there is only a single dwarf woman mentioned in Middle-earth's history, and that is Dis, the sister of Thorin Oakenshield from The Hobbit. Dwarven women were also noted to be so similar in voice and appearance to the men that they couldn't tell the difference. So to me, that strongly implies that dwarf women had deep voices and also beards, and yet no women here are bearded. Disa also seems to be the only black dwarf in existence, which is kind of weird. The fact that dwarves spend almost their entire lives deep underground since the dawn of their race, they wouldn't have had any need for dark skin pigmentation, making her a genetic anomaly. Again, this isn't something Tolkien wrote, this is something that the showrunners put into the series to have it reflect modern day people. But later on, Prince Durin brings the elves' proposal to his father, King Durin, who is more than a little weary of the elves, before opening a chest to some shining object which I believe will be revealed to be mithril, the unbreakable metal that made up the shirt that Frodo wore in Lord of the Rings. I think we'll see the elves find out about mithril and get a hold of some to use in building their forge. A few points I'd like to bring up here. The dialogue between Durin and Disa feels a little too much like a romantic sitcom. Definitely not the type of dialogue that you typically see between lovers in Tolkien's work. Of course, since neither of these characters actually existed in Tolkien's writing, I suppose the writers thought that they could take liberties. And yes, a Durin the Fourth did exist, but it doesn't seem plausible to me that Durin the Third and Fourth would be a father and son. I'm not sure why they weren't just given different names. For those who don't know what I'm talking about, Durin was the oldest and greatest of the first 7 fathers of the dwarves. He became known as Durin the Deathless not just because of his old age, but because it was believed that 5 times he was reincarnated, as 5 members of his line seemed to be so like him in personality and appearance that they were granted the name Durin. So this wasn't something that you just named your son because you wanted them to have a great name. And again, the likelihood that you would have 2 men alive at the same time who best represent Durin seems extremely small, especially when you consider that not every generation had a Durin. Within the span of thousands of years, there only lived 6 dwarves with the name Durin. You're telling me 2 of them were father and son? The last thing I want to point out is that there has been fairly frequent mention of Aule, the smith god, a member of the Valar who not only taught the dwarves the art of smithcraft, but was actually their creator. Unlike the Ainur, elves, and men who were created by the supreme god Iluvatar, the dwarves were created by Aule, making them wholly unique. Though Iluvatar did bestow upon the dwarves the ability to live outside the will of Aule. Assuming that all the events of the show are taking place at the same time, and this isn't like The Witcher where different timelines converge at the end of the first season, then Amazon's timeline of Middle-earth is completely screwy. One potential example, depending on how it plays out, would be the Harfoots, who are currently located in Rovanion, a territory east of the Anduin River. Now, technically, while the Harfoots were the first of the 3 types of hobbits to migrate west of the Misty Mountains, they weren't seen by men in those western regions until the year 1050 of the Third Age. And remember that this show takes place during the Second Age. So I suppose as long as the Harfoots stay east of the foothills of the Misty Mountains, then Amazon isn't breaking any lore with this. Now, there has been a lot of debate online on whether or not any hobbits could be depicted as having any other skin color other than white, with one of the main Harfoots in the show, Sadoc Burrows, played by black comedian Lenny Henry. So, in the prologue of Lord of the Rings, titled Concerning Hobbits, Tolkien gives a brief description of the 3 breeds of hobbits, those being the Harfoots, which are the main group of hobbits, the Stors, and the Fallowhides, which are the least numerous group. He does describe the Harfoots as being browner of skin than the other 2 groups, and that could lead to 2 different interpretations. Either Tolkien was saying there existed different ethnicities of hobbit, or they were white, but maybe a little ruddier in skin tone, or perhaps even olive skin toned like someone from the Mediterranean. He does say that all hobbits share certain characteristics such as average height, hairy feet, pointed ears, round body shape, and short curly brown hair. He also mentions that the Harfoots are the most numerous group of hobbits and that all 3 groups, with the exception of some of the Stors, later blend together once they settle in Eriador where the Shire is located. Now, the creators of the Amazon series have stated they intend for this series to be within the same universe as the Peter Jackson films. And while there were hobbits that were depicted as being very tan, there were none of different ethnicities, meaning either the hobbits had some sort of eugenics program to breed out any non-white hobbits, or there was some type of culling of all non-white humanoid beings north of Harad and west of Rhûn by the time of the Third Age to include the events of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. I don't know how Amazon intends to explain that, but I do know that many of the people arguing for the existence of ethnic hobbits justify the possible change by saying it makes sense that there would be different ethnicities in hobbits because there are different ethnicities of people in the real world. I immediately discount that notion because we're not talking about the real world, and Tolkien didn't write the stories of Middle-earth to be representative of the people of the real world. And when I say Middle-earth, I'm using that term as the colloquial name for Tolkien's works and not just the continent of Middle-earth itself. But I digress. The story with the Harfoots is fairly boring. We get Discount Frodo and Sam who discover Discount Gandalf, and I think it was either the writers or the showrunners who mentioned that the stranger is meant to be of the same kind as Gandalf. Whether that means specifically one of the Astari or wizards, or more broadly, one of the Maiar being the lower rank of the powers or gods I mentioned earlier. Honestly, I'm not really sure. The stranger spends the first 2 episodes stumbling around and yelling and pointing like a cracked out homeless man. Oh, and he came down in a meteor. He can't talk, and he is afraid of hobbits. If this is one of the Maiar, then this is a really fucked up interpretation of them. Lastly, we have our 4th plot line taking place in the Southlands, also called the Lands of Men, which makes it sound like there aren't men further north, even though there should be in the Second Age. But the men of the Southlands are apparently the descendants of the evil men who sided with Morgoth, and their land is being watched over by a company of Sylvan elves to make sure that evil doesn't spring up in that region again. Of course it does, as we meet the elf Arondir. And I'm not going to talk about black elves in this video. I'm going to make a separate video discussing the origin of elves and the existence of dark elves in Middle-earth. But Arondir is in the village located in Tir Harad, looking for clues of a rising darkness alongside Bronwyn. And oh yeah, I forgot to mention the people of the Southlands are racist towards elves because the elves still look at them as potentially evil beings. I'm starting to wonder if they made Arondir black just to be really on the nose about the fact that the people were racist towards him. Which would be ironic because technically the men of the Southlands should be black, or in some cases, Middle Eastern looking. But then again, Tir Harad isn't spoken of in the books, so maybe this is some sort of in-between zone and a mixture of cultures. Arondir does in fact find some sort of creatures in a nearby village, while Bronwyn's son finds an evil-looking sword and gets attacked by what might be an orc. It's kind of hard to tell what they were going for with this design. But their village ends up evacuating after they discover the nearby village of Hordern burned to the ground. And that's the last we see of these characters for the 2 episodes. And I'm going to wrap up this video with my general thoughts so far. I know this has been a lot of play-by-play interspersed with history lessons, but I think it needed to be that way to some degree. Though the video for the next episode should be shorter. But I've already mentioned a lot of the problems that I had with the show as it pertains to Amazon deviating from the source material, so I'm not going to rehash that. That being said, except for a few scenes, this didn't really feel to me like Middle-earth, which is a huge problem. Now, if I was reviewing this as a generic fantasy series, I'd say it's pretty good. But half of the plot lines seem to fall under the horror mystery genre rather than adventure fantasy. Sauron's symbol keeps popping up, and nobody wants to say that they think he's still alive. You've got people all over hiding from the boogeyman that is Sauron or potential remnants of evil from Morgoth, and it just doesn't sit right the way things are playing out. There are also too many things going on. I think there are more plot lines in this series than Game of Thrones or The Witcher had, and it makes for awful pacing. It took 2 hours for me to barely learn anything. Maybe this is an issue that they'll fix in the later seasons, but for now, let's hope that this one gets better. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. I welcome and appreciate any corrections that you can make on my knowledge of Tolkien's lore, so go nuts in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, I'd appreciate it if you hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Also hit that notification bell so you never miss out on a new video. I'll see y'all next time. Bye.